Welcome to Popcorn Psychology, the podcast where we watch blockbuster movies and psychoanalyze them. My name is Brittany Brownfield, and I'm a child therapist, and I'm joined by
Ben Stover, individual therapist.
Hannah Espinoza, marriage and family therapist.
We're all licensed clinical professional counselors, also known as therapists, who practice out of Chicago. Even though we are licensed mental health professionals, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes and to fulfill our love of dissecting pop culture in all forms.
Please remember that even though we are all licensed therapists, we aren't your therapist.
If you are struggling with mental health symptoms, please find a local mental health provider.
Welcome to Season 3 of Popcorn Psychology. We are happy to announce that this season we are a part of the Spreaker Bloom program, and just last week we crossed 100,000 listens, so thank you guys so much for listening to us.
Yeah.
And for all the reviews and love, and for becoming patrons of us on Patreon. All of the support you all have given us over the past 2 seasons has been instrumental to why we are now part of this Bloom program and why we've had so many listens, and we just are really thankful of that. To start this season out, we're going to be doing Joker. We got so many requests for it, so let's take a second and review the plot of Joker. So in this movie, we are introduced to Arthur Fleck, who is a man who is dealing with multiple things going wrong in his life right at the point we meet him. So we see him starting out having a job, seeming like he's fairly content with his life, and then right at the start of the movie, he gets jumped by some kids, which starts the downfall of his mental health in the movie. We learn that Arthur has been a mental health patient. He's dealt with multiple hospitalizations. He's taking medications, and he has several conditions. None of them are ever named in the film, but we will definitely be covering that in this episode, what we see as professionals. But what we see throughout this film is that as Arthur's continues to have situations happen to him, his symptoms get worse. He deals with failures from the city on the system on a macro and a micro level, right? And then we see him continue to progress deeper into a full-blown psychiatric episode that ends up ending in violence. And we chose this movie because this episode has gotten more requests than any other episode we have encountered throughout our time doing this podcast, and we're into season 3. That's saying a lot. So I want to take a second, thank all of you for all of your requests. We got them on email, on social media, on our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, everywhere personally. So thank all of you that have been listening and care enough to ask us to do this, and we're happy to be doing that as the start of our 3rd season. We also thought this movie, for the most part, takes a really interesting look at showing chronic mental illness in a way that most movies don't. However, it also takes some steps where it undoes everything that it did. And we're definitely going to talk about that too, because
Sure.
We've all worked with chronic mental illness in our career, and it kind of shows a side that, oh my God, yes, we all saw this every day in our career, and yes, these things happen, and then where it spirals into violence, like, no, you just undid it all. But we will definitely be talking about that. What we're going to do is we're going to cover the diagnosis that we see. We're going to talk about a case conceptualization, in which we'll talk about kind of what we see in Arthur, his biopsychosocial history, what treatment plans we might have for him, and then get into final thoughts. So we're going to take a second and get right into the diagnosis we see so that we can cover the terms that we're going to be using throughout the episode so that we'll all have a common definition.
Sure. So the first diagnosis we're going to be exploring in this movie is bipolar 1. Not to get too wordy, but most recent episode, manic episode, severe with psychotic features. It's a lot of words. So I'm going to give a bit of the definition as the criteria as defined by the diagnostic manual. So bipolar 1 is when someone is experiencing both manic episodes and depressive episodes. So a manic episode is a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive, or irritable mood, and abnormally and persistently increased goal-directed activity or energy, lasting at least 1 week and present most of the day, nearly every day. So it's someone who's pretty pumped up and very, like when it says goal-directed, like really driven to do certain things and get things completed. So during that period of that heightened mood and increased activity and energy, 3 or more of the following symptoms will most likely be present, and they kind of have to be to get this diagnosis. So inflated self-esteem or grandiosity, decreased need for sleep, sometimes going days without sleeping, more talkative than usual, or what we call pressured speech, which is talking really fast, kind of like this when I talk like this. That's pressured speech. Flight of ideas or subjective experiences that thoughts are racing. So racing thoughts that are going really fast, kind of in line with the speaking very quickly and pressured. Distractibility, so hard to keep their attention, very easily distracted. Increase in goal-directed activity, like I said, like having something they feel like they have to accomplish and getting really stuck on that. Or excessive involvement in activities that have a high potential for painful consequences. So what we would call risky behaviors. Shopping too much, having unsafe sexual behaviors, just not really paying attention to how they can get hurt. And then this should cause a marked impairment in their social or functioning. By that, I mean it would impact their ability to keep a job, to have good relations with other people, that kind of thing. And this wouldn't be something that would be attributed to a substance use or like a medical condition. And then a depressive episode is kind of an opposite sort of thing. You are depressed most of the day, nearly every day. You're not really interested in anything anymore. You don't find pleasure in much things. Significant weight loss might be happening. You might sleep too much or not be able to sleep at all. You might move really slowly or really quickly. Kind of, you're not really moving at a rate that's what we consider quote unquote normal. You're feeling really tired, a loss of energy nearly every day, feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt, like everything's my fault, I'm a bad person kind of stuff. Diminished ability to think or concentrate, so still a distractibility or lack of attention. And then recurrent thoughts of death. So thinking about how you would die, not necessarily planning to do it, but those thoughts might be floating through your head pretty regularly. So for a depressive episode, you have to have 5 of those symptoms to fit that criteria. And then another diagnosis we'll be discussing too is schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is where you have to be experiencing 2 or more of the following, what we call like psychotic symptoms, which would be delusions, hallucinations, also disorganized speech where you're not really making sense, or grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior. It's the same kind of thing where what way you're behaving is not making sense, or you're kind of frozen is sort of the catatonic behavior. And then what we call negative symptoms, which isn't what you think. Like it doesn't mean like bad symptoms or sad symptoms. It means like a lack of. So you'd have your face would have like no expression on it. Or your voice would be very flat, as we say, like very flat intonation, kind of like that. And that your schizophrenia, to have it for a significant portion of time, since the onset of the disturbance, level of functioning is also broken down. So your ability to work, your ability to have social relationships, romantic relationships, that kind of thing would also possibly disrupt your ability to take care of yourself, like your hygiene, keeping up your apartments or your home, things like that. You'd have to have continuous signs of these symptoms for at least 6 months. And you would have to rule out having bipolar disorder. So we'll kind of get into later is one versus the other. So you can't have both bipolar and schizophrenia simultaneously. And then what we also see in these movie, the other diagnosis we'll be touching upon is pseudo-Bipolar affect. I'll have you handle that, Ben.
So pseudo-Bipolar affect is the condition that we see him handing the card out for. That is a condition where people have inappropriate laughing or crying that doesn't seem to match their mood. And so when we see Arthur laughing when he's not intending to laugh, that is the actual technical diagnosis or diagnostic term for that is pseudo-Bipolar affect. And that is something that is caused primarily by having had a traumatic brain injury, which we learn later on in the film happened to Arthur when he was a boy, that his head got beaten by some of his mom's boyfriends. That he had a traumatic brain injury from that, which traumatic brain injury is really as simple as it defines it. It's that you had an injury to the head or a concussive blast wave damaged the brain to the point where it changed the way that it functions. It injured a part of the brain, and it's typically a permanent injury, although a concussion is qualified as a traumatic brain injury and the effects of that can be reversed. However, in a case like Arthur's, it is clear that this is going to be a permanent thing. So that would be pseudobulbar affect, the inappropriate laughing or crying, not necessarily representative of the emotions or mood currently encountered by the person experiencing the outbursts of laughter or crying, and it is not something in their control.
And we tend to shorten traumatic brain injury to TBI. So in the rest of the episode, if you hear us say TBI, it's because we're meaning traumatic brain injury, because that's really long to say.
It is really long to say. And the last thing that we will be covering, or at least is a part of this, is trauma. I don't see enough to give him PTSD necessarily.
Post-traumatic stress disorder?
Right, post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'm not going to be defining that. We've also defined that in several other episodes, including ones on Batman Begins and Logan and several others throughout the course of the podcast. But the prominence of trauma in Arthur's case, where we find out that he's been beaten several times in his adult life, let alone chained to a radiator, faced neglect, and faced dealing with a mother who had a personality disorder and a mother who is mentally ill. All of those things can add up to psychological trauma, which a trauma is basically a psychic injury, right? It's a experience of a awful event where you perceive loss of status, life, death, sexual violence, and we learn later that Arthur has encountered all of those. Mm-hmm. And to not include that in a case conceptualization of Arthur Fleck would be irresponsible.
And maybe we should define a case conceptualization. It's hard to say, as you're noticing. We're stumbling over it. Mm-hmm. Basically, it's just a fancy schmancy psychology way of saying, where do we see all these symptoms? The bigger picture of someone and what that looks like so it's how we as professionals might discuss a client as a whole and try to sort of figure out what's going on and where all these symptoms are landing.
And what we're going to do about it once we figure it out.
Exactly.
And so part of what you always do, right, when we're looking at someone who's experiencing all different kinds of symptoms, is we kind of want to paint a picture of how we think everything is affecting them. So we do that by using a BioPsychoSocial model, kind of. So basically all that means is that we're looking at kind of any organic problems, like any real medical issues that could have anything to do with it, as well as more of the psychological aspects of what this person has experienced, as well as what their environment is like and the social aspects of being a human, basically.
So nature versus nurture, to sum it up.
Sure. And so with Arthur, we start out and kind of, going into this basically because we've all seen the whole movie. So knowing from the beginning that Arthur experienced severe trauma in all the ways that Ben already described. So knowing that will have an effect on him no matter what else happens throughout his lifetime.
Yes.
Like the way that he was raised, especially having a mother who has chronic mental illness herself, possibly a personality disorder is also commented on for her. And then finding out that is just the first step. And also those are things that he doesn't even realize, doesn't even really have access to those memories from what we can tell, because I think he seems surprised when he finds that out.
Yes.
He seems very surprised. Mm-hmm. He has suppressed none of that, which is part of what will happen during trauma, is that people can get into avoidance and suppression of the event and the memory that has happened.
Yeah, so sort of a fact or fiction of this movie is him not remembering his whole childhood, kind of, or at least the trauma of his childhood, or the abuse from his mother and her significant others, is real. That happens to people. I've seen people in my office remember something that they never hadn't remembered in years in front of my eyes, and it can be truly as upsetting as he shows in the movie, where it's almost like a big secret in their brain that they didn't even know it was there. Like, it can be truly shocking. And so that's real, and that's not just a movie ploy of like a plot twist. Like, that really does happen to people.
Yeah, absolutely. The brain can absolutely do what's called dissociate you away from that, where it can kind of file that memory away somewhere separate and close it off.
Yes.
To your active memory. What doesn't happen is that it doesn't go out of your subconscious. It doesn't stop affecting how you behave and react to things, because your brain is still informed by that, but it won't let it cross into your active mind so that he's not going to remember it.
So, and where we see that in the movie is there's several moments in the movie where Arthur is being yelled at or being harmed in some way. There's two specific moments I remember in which he dissociates. And by that is when you just kind of, you space out, like you're not present anymore for when harm is being done to you. Because it's a way to protect ourselves, especially if you're abused as a child. You learn how to dissociate as a way to keep living. And kind of, you make it separate from you. So one distinct moment was when he was being yelled at by his boss for the sign, I think, breaking.
Right.
He's smiling, and it's kind of the way that you do the music or something, the way that they film it, it's very clear that he's not really there anymore. And so that's a moment when he's using what he learned as a child to deal with it. Like, he's just not going to be there. And then I think also there's the moment on the train when he's being beat up by those guys before he gets violent, where it seems like he's starting to dissociate, like the way the sound is, like he's pulling away. And so what's interesting about that is with the memory stuff is when you dissociate, there's a good chance that you're not going to form memories during that time. So there's a good chance that after Arthur left that meeting with his boss, he might not remember what was said at all. It would be just like when when you drive home and you get highway hypnosis and then you can't remember like the last 5 minutes of driving. It's a similar experience to that from what I've been informed by clients. It's just like you like are in a daze and you wake up and you're like, oh, what just happened?
Right, and that's just a very common trauma symptom. And so when we look at Arthur's case, we're going to talk about BioPsychoSocial. We're going to look at it in that order because that's how we're going to look at it when we review a client, right? Mm-hmm. When we're doing an intake assessment of a client, we're going to be taking the client in, trying to learn about their story, the information that they have about themselves. And what we're always going to want to know about is what biological features do we need to account for when we're considering a diagnosis here? Because some things, like medical conditions, will influence behavior in ways that could be accounted for by a psychological disorder. But if there's a medical disorder causing it in the first place, that would be something that would cause us to have to reconsider what diagnosis or treatment route we're going to take. And the presence of a TBI in Arthur is a perfect example of that. Yeah. And the pseudobulbar affect. If we are seeing someone's mood not match the what we call affect, which is their facial and body language and presentation, the facial expressions and body language is affect, we'd be missing a whole lot with Arthur if we didn't understand that came from a brain injury. Yeah,
it's sort of, as we touched upon with bipolar disorder, so mood disorders in general, we would have to decide, does he have a genuine mood disorder that's separate from his traumatic brain injury? Or is his traumatic brain injury what's causing these odd fluctuations in his mood and the way that the way he shows himself to the world doesn't really match what's going on?
Right, which we would call an incongruent affect. Mm-hmm. Which that is frequently a symptom of schizophrenia. Is seeing an incongruent affect. Mm-hmm. And with Arthur, if we were just seeing that and didn't know that he had his brain injured, starting to wonder, like, okay, is he someone that is dealing with something on the schizophrenia spectrum? Because schizophrenia is all spectrum now. It used to be broken down into several different subtypes, dealing with catatonia, where they don't move, or are they dealing with hallucinations? Are they someone who deals with only negative symptoms, positive symptoms? All of that stuff got taken out of the evaluation and is just on a spectrum of schizophrenia since the DSM-5 came out. But what are they disorganized? Those are some of the subtype things we would have used to see. We don't anymore because it's all just schizophrenia now. However, Arthur doesn't have that.
Well, I guess something we could just bring up is, why are we talking about bipolar at all with a case where it seems like this guy's must be? I would imagine if I was watching this and I didn't have any training in mental health, I would be like, this guy has schizophrenia. Like, what do you mean by? I wouldn't even occur to me to think bipolar.
And I think especially because also the way we just view things in media in general, that someone who hears voices or sees things is portrayed as having schizophrenia to some capacity. So I also think that it's also based on just like being in pop culture in general, that I feel like if you didn't have any awareness of the differences, basically, that would seemingly be the diagnosis that we would be discussing. But that it really does match Bipolar 1 with psychotic features.
And I think that's a good thing to point out is I don't think most people, including myself before I worked in the field, realize that you can have psychotic features with mood disorders. Like, I would think if I didn't know any better that if you had psychotic features at all, like you were saying, Hannah, then you must have schizophrenia. And there's like no other way to think about that.
Correct. And that's definitely the way, like Hannah's saying, is that it is represented in that the colloquial knowledge might be. But psychotic features can appear in mood states where the mood state is so severely dysregulated that they break from reality.
Yes.
And that can happen with both depression, independent of bipolar disorder, and mania, where they are so out of touch with reality that they would be referred to as psychotic. Because some people can be severely depressed and still be in touch with reality, and some people can get so severely depressed where they get completely detached from reality and start believing things that aren't true, hearing things, seeing things, and the same thing can happen on the side of mania. And in Arthur, why we say that we're seeing bipolar is that if you look at what the presentation of his symptoms are, we see Arthur in two distinct states throughout the film. We don't see a middle, except he seems more regulated in the early parts of the film when he's clearly on his medication.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right? So that has to factor into the bio part of this, is that bio would include organic brain issues and what medications or drugs are in the system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? We have no evidence of Arthur drinking or using drugs throughout the film.
True. He doesn't strike me as a person who does anyway.
He doesn't.
Yeah.
But
agreed.
But we see nothing in there.
Yeah.
No use of it. So there's no evidence of it. There's no point in times where he's drinking, or I think anyone is drinking, honestly.
Yeah, agreed.
But so we could rule that out as a factor of his moods. But what we see is that we learn that he was taking 7 medications.
Yeah.
And that at some point funding gets cut and he doesn't know where he's going to get his medications anymore.
And so the assumption is that some way midway through the movie, he's no longer on medication.
Correct. Because with bipolar, usually you see 2 distinct periods of time, and they can last for 2 weeks or a week at a time, where you see a stable mood state and then it switches rapidly. That's what bipolar 1 is. Mm-hmm. There's not often an up and down, which is how it's often used in the public realm, where like, oh, somebody's so bipolar, their mood can switch up and down. Like, no,
it's not just because someone's happy with you and then all of a sudden they're pissed at you. Like it doesn't flip like once an hour or once every 15 minutes, kind of how you see it maybe more displayed in like media or how it's kind of joked about. It is really like you're hanging out in either a manic state or a depressed state for like days at a time. Weeks. Usually until like kind of with the manic, how it always seems to be is it's until like you can no longer sustain being that pumped up because your body just can't sustain it. And then you kind of fall into a depressive state as almost as a way of like getting your resources back up, kind of. Right.
And with bipolar 1, a true manic state will almost always end in hospitalization. Mm-hmm. It can reach that natural fall, but usually they get to the point where it gets so bad that someone is not safe anymore.
So why are we thinking of Arthur as manic? Like, what are we seeing that him do in this movie that feels like he's having a manic episode?
So where I see it is that when we see him, when we learn he's not taking his meds anymore, which is what I assume, which is also the biggest challenge with bipolar clients.
Sure.
Is that he goes from this depressed state after he loses his job, where he's talking about like everything. I just have bad thoughts. All I have is bad thoughts.
Yeah.
Pain all the time. Like, I just feel bad all the time.
He definitely seems like he's in a depressive episode. He's so skinny, which is can be a symptom of depression, like either weight gain or weight loss. He seems like he's staying up a lot, but that could be either thing. And just sad and having all the negative, like you said, all I have are negative thoughts, like you just said. Like, he just comes off as very genuinely sad, like a classic depression state. All
right, he's walking around sad. And then as we go through the film, we see a sharp shift when he gets ready to go on that show. Mm-hmm. It happens a bit before that when he murders his friend.
Yeah.
But that's all the start. I guess the start of the manic episode is when he's dyeing his hair.
You think?
I think that's when the symptoms get really pronounced. It's like he's starting to dance. Like, he's always dancing throughout the movie a little bit when he's in a good space. But when he gets into like that elation stage of mania. Like he starts like dancing and really feeling himself.
He does seem elated. Like when he's doing his hair, he's kind of like giggling at himself and like, ha, like it is that. It's a very specific energy of just like really pumped up and like kind of almost edgy pumped upness.
Right. And that can be triggered by someone having a genuine positive event. Like he doesn't know he's getting called on the show to get made fun of.
Yeah. I think he knows.
I think he knows.
He told call me Joker because you called me a joker. Like he knows. I mean, he came on that show to like make a big scene and I think as to tell this talk show host to go screw himself. Like it's a big
because he also practices what he's gonna do on the show on the couch.
He practices
at his house
killing himself.
Yeah, but I still think that's a big screw you to like the universe and the talk show host for making fun of him.
Yeah, I think he very much has awareness of that.
But I would say that's goal-directed behavior. Like it's a goal-directed activity.
No, absolutely.
Like I'm gonna dress up and I need to do this and I'm gonna get all ready and like almost like a piece to knowing what he's gonna do. Mm-hmm. Like, and acting very oddly, like painting his face and all this stuff that should make people on edge, but he's not quite there. Because I think, like you're saying too, that is also when he starts the psychotic features more come in, where he's truly not with reality in the bigger ways as well. Is like not kind of. I mean, you could argue, does he understand how off-putting he's being, or is he purposely being off-putting by the end, and that kind of stuff, but not really being in tune with how he's making people feel.
Right.
Either.
Well, he loses that completely, but he's where we see like those manic symptoms. Right. We see that behavior starting is at that point where his behavior starts to get, his mood starts to shift.
Yeah.
In a fast way from where he was. Like when he puts that comic on, he's going down those stairs. Mm-hmm. Like the embodiment that Joaquin Phoenix did of the character that's a different character.
Well, and also like
it's
even
totally
when
different
he's
character.
In the subway and he's like, you can tell that I think the joke I made to Hannah when we were watching it was that someone should make a cut of the stairs scene to like Beyonce's Feeling Myself, because like he's like smoking that ciggy, getting off the train while the cops were running past him, and he's just like got this strut in his walk that he's never really had before. Like that feels like the part that's the feelings of self-esteem and grandiosity. That's sort of like, I am it, man. Like I am the coolest. And he is having that feeling now. Which, of course, he didn't have before, because before you could tell that he did not think much, if anything, of himself.
No, not at all. And this dramatic shift.
Yes.
And he's had several things that come like that. The murders that happened on the train, which may or may not have been him. Sure. He's an unreliable narrator, and he's the narrator. So
yeah, I think that
I don't know that was actually him, or that was a psychosis where he saw that had happened on the train and then put himself into it.
Because that's also like delusions of grandeur is a way that's also people talk about with bipolar disorder, which is like thinking you are like you're the queen of something. That's a really dramatic example, but that you are a big deal.
Right.
And so I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah. Like you're saying, if he just read about, because everyone's reading about it in the movie, they do show that everyone's reading about it. And so is he seeing that and then thinking it's him? And then thinking, like, I've made all this stuff happen. And, like, kind of like the speech he gives on the talk show. Like, everybody's doing this because of me. And I think also a repeated theme throughout the movie is, like, when he talks to his therapist, he's like, no one sees me. And then when he's, like, on the car at the end and he's, like, Jesus, pretty much. And he's like, everyone kind of sees me. And so I think it's that thing of feeling very seen and important. It makes me wonder, too, at the end, like, how much of that was real, too.
I think none of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think any of the stuff at the end was real.
Mm-hmm.
I think getting into the police car was real.
Yeah.
I don't think getting rescued out of the police car and becoming the social pariah was real at all.
Yeah. Agreed.
Because that would take planning on the parts of those guys that rammed the police car.
It would take planning, but what we see in people that are bipolar and in experiencing a full-blown manic episode that hits a severe status, because it can be mild, moderate, or severe. Yeah. This hits, and with or without psychotic features, right? So this hits that full-blown state, but someone isn't in that state would absolutely have that grandiosity where they would believe that, yes, the whole city would see me as the leader of this movement. Yes, this would be a huge moment for me. Yes, that happened. And then when you combine it with the psychotic features of not being in touch with reality and believing that stuff is happening, that's where it gets really messy and difficult, and why it often requires hospitalization is because they're not in reality anymore. like that. I think all that happened in his head. I think he got put in the police car and started dissociating and had psychotic features.
Like fantasizing almost. Yeah.
Right, but it reached a different level because he believed he was in it, as opposed to when he was seeing himself on Murray's show and being part of the audience. That was just a pure fantasy.
Yeah, that was his daydreaming.
Right.
And that felt different.
This felt very different, where he felt it was real and it was happening. But then all of a sudden, the next scene, we see he's in the hospital.
Yeah.
So how do you get there?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Like, his, like, little... If he was really, like, the leader of this social movement, they would have, I assume, scurried him away and kept him safe in, like, one of their apartments.
Well, I mean,
mom's basement.
If they're willing to ram a police car to rescue him, they're not going to surrender him to the police.
That's
Absolutely.
true. That's a very good point I didn't even think about. And then I think another thing to bring up, too, with the psychotic features part of it is the relationship with the woman in his apartment building. Mm-hmm. That is more a psychotic features that are triggered, in my opinion, by like the depressive episodes he's experiencing.
Yes.
Because that's the moments when he is. So I'm just bringing this up because it's not just the manic that you'd have depressive, like you'd have psychotic features. Like it's also the depressive portions, because she tends to pop up when he's having a harder time. Not always in the movie, but it's like right after he had that distressing moment on the subway. Then he's making out with her in her apartment. When his mom is in the hospital, she's there comforting him. When he's doing that gig where he's doing stand-up and he's really anxious, she's in the audience making him feel better. When that doesn't go very well, she's saying basically everyone else is haters and you're the best. So that's also where his psychotic features come about when he is really depressed. It's more like needing comfort in those times when he's very lonely.
I agree, and I think the most frightening moment in the entire movie is when the movie turns, is really when you see him go into her apartment, because he's been believing that relationship is real. Yeah. And you watch her switch. Zazie Beetz did great acting there, and you see that look of like terror on her face. Like, and she asked him like, "You live across the hall, right?"
Do you think he hurt her?
No,
I didn't think so either.
I don't think he hurt her either. I think it was very much him being stuck in his psychosis.
And he was having a hard time, yeah.
Yeah, I think he very much was, and like just reacting to that and playing that out physically, which is why, you know, we saw that look on her face like, what is happening? But also did a really good job of handling her own stuff in terms of her response. Like, I guess based on the fact that they make him seem like he is violent when he gets to this point, which is not true in real life, that if she would have screamed, I feel like, or which anyone is a totally normal response to some man being in your apartment. Yeah. I think that we would have seen a different outcome. But I think very much because she was like, you live across the hall with your mom, right? Are you okay? Please don't hurt me. Like, I think very much it was her response very much, I think, helped with him being able to either stop dissociating or stop or kind of pull back and be like, oh, right. And even I also don't feel like he was connected to reality when he got up and walked out of the apartment. But I think that at least there was some part of him that was like, oh, I'm in the wrong spot. I'm not in the right place.
Yeah, and I think that really demonstrates for us as the audience that he wasn't just like fantasizing about a relationship with her. Like the fact that he was in her apartment shows that he really thought he was having a relationship with her, which is why we would classify it as a psychotic features and not just he's just being creepy or whatever.
Right. No, he was very clearly broken from reality. Whatever reality was happening in his mind, whatever internal stimuli is what we call it, he was responding to, were not reflective of what was actually happening in reality. Mm-hmm. Like, he may have had the interaction with her where he did the whole gun thing. Like that may have been real.
The elevator scene in the very beginning.
The elevator scene, that was probably real. And they probably had that interaction, but everything beyond that, where they go on dates or where he bursts into her apartment and kisses her, and right after murdering those guys on the train, which may or may not have happened, all of that, I don't think it happened. But
I think it's really interesting that neither one of you thinks that happened. I totally think that happened.
Well, I guess there was the cops after the fact, but is that real?
Well,
the cops, also kind of
the cops were
the cops
after the fact,
him.
But also the reading of the story was all after. So I don't know. But I mean, also, I think what you guys are describing also makes sense. So I don't think it's like one is right and one is wrong. I think there's definitely a chance that either one happened.
Yeah, I think we're supposed to be left ambiguous with that of did he actually do this or not? Like, he may have, or he may have been fantasizing about it and having delusions that he killed them because he got attacked on the train.
And finally being in a place where he feels like he would have the power to do that to someone, right? And so like having that grandiosity and that self-esteem of like, nobody is going to hurt me anymore, and I have control over this and I can protect myself, where we see in the opening scene, because the other thing that I noticed when he gets beat up in that first scene is he knows what to do, like when he gets beat up,
which is to crumple,
crumple, to crawl, to cover his middle areas, and like he knows what to do. And so the fact that that happens also, I feel like, gives us some insight into terms of this is not the first time this has happened to him.
Nope.
And I feel like it happens pretty consistently throughout his life.
Right. In Pokemon terms, we call that the defense curl.
Okay. Nerd alert.
I know. I had to.
You somehow made a movie about Batman, which is you always talk about, and something even nerdier than that. You went down to the sub-basement of being a nerd.
To be fair, I wasn't a Pokemon kid, but I, like the loose experiments I had with playing the game.
Were you not?
I was not.
Okay.
I was not.
Oh, okay.
I was not. I was a little too old for it, just a little bit.
Yeah.
And I didn't have a Game Boy. But the things that we see with that I think give us some indication that might not have been real is that the lighting and the train starts to change and the music changes and we start to experience things like that could be indicating to us that his mental status is changing, or it could be that he entered a psychotic state.
Dude, I was looking at that movie so fucking hard to see if the lighting was different when I said to Brittany, I was like, look, I think the light is different when he's having a hallucination. And then I was like, no, it's not. Because it did happen consistently in some areas. And I agree with you about the light changing and kind of the background getting really fuzzy and kind of like pixelated a little bit.
Right.
So anyway, I really felt like they were trying to show us that too, but...
Right, and it's something that does happen when it's a clue that things aren't real, that I had to watch it on my second time to get it, was there's clock ticking. The clocks never move in the movie.
Yeah, I know. I wrote down all the times. Because there was all these things that I heard people saying after everybody saw it about how the clock is the same, and I thought that meant something else completely, which it did not mean. But yeah, you're right. There is the clocks are all the same.
And they show us one flash that they're not the same time throughout the whole movie, but it never moves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In the scene, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things that gives me an indication of where he was starting to break is when he's sitting in the office and finds out she's leaving. The social worker is leaving. And we see the hands on the clock it's at 10:10.
11:10.
Is it 11:10?
Yes.
Fine, it's 11:10. But it's also when it flashes to him hitting his head against the wall in the psychiatric facility, it is the same time.
I know.
Yeah, Hannah brought
That's
that
what
up
I
and
wrote
watched
it down. I wrote it down because I was trying to figure out what the hell the people were talking about.
But there it is. But so we see those things. Anyway, we're going like looking back at his conceptualization. We're like starting to prove here some of the things that we're seeing with bipolar disorder.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing is he's going through two distinct mood states throughout this film.
Yeah,
right. We see a lot of evidence for him being depressed, and we see when he stops taking his medications and things start to happen, and then his response to them starts to change dramatically. Mm-hmm. And finding out, like, he starts getting into more risky and more impulsive behavior.
For sure.
Throughout the film, and it's a hard switch. It doesn't go back down.
Yeah.
It's a hard switch. Like,
he's just doing wacky stuff, like when he takes all the shelves out of his fridge and then goes into his fridge. I don't know if that maybe was something, if we're going to think about the biosocial part, like when he was a kid, that he used to hide in safe places, and maybe one of those safe places was cold, and so now that he's feeling kind of discombobulated, he's like goes into his fridge, or just because he's not thinking clearly, and so he's just thinking, I want to be somewhere and the fridge is the closest, or you know what I mean, like, or that's maybe a part of him that's really,
or maybe being in a place where it is very tight to his body, so maybe also a way for him to be soothed in terms of sensory experiences, like maybe where his whole body would feel the same because it's all enclosed in the fridge, or the idea of as a kid hiding in a cupboard and being surrounded, like very much also just trying to reset, or it's just in reaction to psychosis, like it's really hard, like I feel like it's kind of hard to know. I felt like the dancing that he shows throughout the movie was a way that he was soothing himself. And wondered if that was something that he did as a kid, but also noticed, like you said, how him being more connected to his body definitely happens when he's in a more manic state.
And when he dances with his mom at that one point, so I wonder if that's something like one of the few things they did that was really pleasant together. Because that was
Yes,
a nice
I agree with
moment
that.
in the movie, is them
Yeah.
dancing together.
Yeah, it was.
And his mom seemed really happy when they were doing that. So I'm sure that's probably something they did a lot growing up. That's kind of a touchstone for their relationship in a positive way.
Right. So we see like these psychological features, right? So like the bio is the TBI, and the pseudobulbar affect is medications. And we see that the reaction to people in society to him when he's having those pseudobulbar affect moments, when he's laughing and people treating him poorly because of that, him getting beat and injured, and him getting beat when he's a kid causing the TBI, and not having medications all contribute to the bio. The psycho seeing the psychological symptoms now come out, and the way he's interpreting things and the breaks from reality. What about the social?
Well, I mean, he doesn't really have one, unfortunately. He has some sort of friends at work. I mean, I thought it was very sweet that those guys did come to his house when they learned that his mom died. I know the tall guy, Randall, screwed him over.
No, girl.
No, girl. No.
They were coming. He was coming to. Oh
Did I read the whole
God! To
situation
Claire.
wrong?
The little person was his friend.
Yes.
Yes, that's what I mean.
Yes.
Randall was not his friend.
Yeah, I know. I mean, Randall's not good. But I mean, like, the fact that they were even checking up on him.
Randall was there to make sure he didn't tell the cops that
okay.
he got the gun from him.
But
That's why he was there, and why he killed him.
he doesn't have a social life, really. The only social life we think he has in the movie, he's straight up made up in his mind. It's not real.
Correct. It's just his mother.
His social, even when he's, like, his social skills are not good. Like, he follows that woman, the woman that we think he's dating. He follows her, like, all day one day.
Correct. I think that
And-
happened.
I think that happened
too. And you can tell by the way he's behaving. He knows he puts his hood up, so there's a part of him that knows that he's trying to be sneaky. I assume, and then, but also, he's not being very covert about it. In my opinion, he's really close to her. It just seems like to me, and it does seem like the way he just is in the world. Like, he doesn't quite get how he makes people feel, but he's also because of all this life leading up to that point, he looks really disheveled. He's very thin. You know, he looks like something's off about him. And so when he has interactions in the world, when he's trying to be engaged, because he has got a sweetness to him, at least in the beginning, he's very shut down socially by other people. Like when he tries to make that kid laugh on the train and the mom's really like verbally abusive to him. Like, he's such an isolated person, and he's isolated with his mother, who's also not nice to him. And so he's so alone in a way that you also kind of might concave into your fantasies just because you're so isolated. So that it contributes to the psychotic features.
And
Yes,
that it would.
absolutely.
Sorry, Ben.
Oh no, go ahead. I'm just agreeing with her.
And that it would make a lot of sense that doing a job of playing a clown
Yeah.
would be something that would feel comfortable in terms of him being able to interact with the world in a different way.
Because he's not shy.
He isn't shy, but I think it's also because people experiencing him differently when he's dressed as a clown. So he
Yeah.
doesn't have to worry about all of the real ways that people interact with him, because it's clear that he's aware that the affect problem that he has upsets people.
Because he has a card.
Because he has a
means
card
it,
that
yeah.
says it. So
Laminated.
so he is aware that that is something that people can experience from him. Do I think socially he knows how to deal with it? I don't think so. But also there's no way for him to stop it from happening. Like, it's an effect from him having a TBI. Like, there isn't it's not a symptom of a mental illness. It's a symptom of him having a TBI, and that this is what happens sometimes when you experience that. So I don't know that he has I don't think that socially, based on his isolation, that he knows how to kind of lean into that in a different way instead of just handing a card.
Mm-hmm. And it makes me wonder too if he was very isolated as a kid as well. Like, if he and his mom were very isolated together.
Guarantee it.
And
Yes.
so then, because he does seem like someone who's very earnestly trying to be of the world and in the world. But my assumption would be, as a kid, he was just deprived of learning those building blocks of socializing. And then if he was, as we know, so institutionalized probably for a big bulk of his life, or somewhat of a chunk of his
Prior to being
yes.
adopted.
Well, no, even no. Like they show the flashback where he's like, I've been in the hospital, and he's slamming his head against the wall.
Yeah.
So like he's also been institutionalized
Yes.
as an adult, and so he just has been deprived of a lot of experiences that help you create social skills.
Because especially also going back to it being 1981, it also very much is a period of time where people who had chronic mental illness very much were isolated.
Yes.
And that you were just put in a room and not interacted with. Like, they definitely did not handle chronic mental illness in a way that made a lot of sense at that time either. So also experiencing that isolation and being very much identified as other in every single setting he goes into. Mm-hmm. So it would also make a lot of sense that he, like you said, he just didn't have the experience to be able to know how to interact with more people because he's been so isolated in so many different ways. And I think always. Right.
And I mean, think like about that time period. Think about Terminator 2, Sarah Connor.
I don't.
Hannah's never seen it. It's one of my favorite movies, but Hannah's never seen it. I know. Unclench your fists, Ben.
Get out, Hannah. Out.
But
go home and watch Terminator 2.
But I think it's that ironic thing where
glorious.
Where you have delusions or whatever, or like just mental health symptoms, then you get isolated within an institution, and that gives your brain a lot of space to then kind of fold into that. And I would also say too, like, not to get to the treatment portion yet, but like the social worker he has in this movie, she also does not do any work with helping him socially, and she continues, in my opinion, the othering of him. Like, like she's very like the distance she puts between them of like having a desk between them, and it's, you know, and the way she speaks to him, he calls her yes ma'am, like they don't have a relationship. They have like she's an authority figure, and she's not helping him socialize either at all. No,
and she represents yet another loss for him. Like, even though she's not really helping him, she represents a failure of the system.
Absolutely.
So the identity he had of having like a therapist, having someone to help him, having a place to go, he could unload that and be himself and have that, gets taken away. And that loss of having that space is a big blow to someone's social interaction, especially people who view that as their time, the only time that they get to talk to someone who treats them like a person, even though this particular social worker in the interactions we see doesn't do a phenomenal job of that. We still see that that's someone who's willing to listen to him, which with people with chronic mental illness is a major blow to take that away.
I think she sucks. Like, I wrote she sucks in my notes. Like,
she does suck.
I don't know if she's classifying herself as a therapist in this movie. Like, that's her role. She strikes me as a caseworker, like more of a case manager, who is almost against her will having to pretend to be his therapist. Like, the journaling thing, it seemed weak as hell. Like, she was like, well, have you been keeping your journal? It's like someone who doesn't know how to be a therapist who's been put in a role of a therapist is the energy she was giving to me. But might have been the style of back then, of it's very like task oriented, like hitting, like she's hitting these points with him, like almost like she's going through a form.
It's the height of CBT.
Yeah, and she's not. Would you want to expand on that?
The height of cognitive behavioral therapy stuff was starting to really evolve in the 70s and 80s, so where there's a strong shift from getting away from letting people tell their story and getting going through all the things that have happened to them, to shifting to focus on, okay, that's happened, what are you going to do to deal with the symptoms of it so that you can get yourself back to functional by learning to recognize the way you think about things, how the way you think about something and interpret something changes how you feel and behave about it. And there's a huge focus on that at this point in time. And
it's very homework based. Yeah. It's very like workbooky activity based. Like, I give you a task to complete, which is what you see in the movie, which is a good point, Ben. She goes, did you bring the journal that I had you fill out last time? And I think where it feels really bad for me watching as a clinician is that CBT for some people is the best for them. Like, that's what they really work with. I work at a job right now where it's very CBT focused. Like, that is really helpful if that's what the client needs and it's what they're asking for. You can tell by the way that Arthur is interacting with her that she's not hitting him where he lives. Like, no. He wants someone to listen to him, and he wants more like what we'd call person-centered counseling, where it is kind of the old school where he lays on a couch and he just gets to talk and he feels someone empathically listen to him. Like, she's not, in my opinion, demonstrating any empathy towards him.
I think she very much is portraying a burnt out social worker in the 80s when all of their funding got cut and the state when hospitals got closed. I think she very much is demonstrating somebody who's been in a system that is so broken that she is burnt out in terms of what she even has the capability to do.
Yeah.
It also makes me think about whether or not his treatment is mandated, which might be why she has certain things she has to ask him.
Yeah.
And that's all possible. And I think those are all really important points to consider, like when evaluating her. Well, my angle with looking at Arthur is what that would be like for him, and to the
for sure,
like, you know, for like looking at clients, that value that they place even in a relationship with a bad social worker, a bad therapist, is losing that is still a big loss, because it's a loss of some of their social time where they get to be out of the house and feel like someone's attention is on them, even if she sucks.
Yeah, absolutely. And it absolutely would be a loss for him.
Yep.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think even though we see his frustration with her and him not having any rapport with her, not feeling connected to her relationship wise, but also knowing that he doesn't talk to anyone else besides his mom. And so having anyone else that he can talk to in some senses is some relief, or some way for him to kind of embrace a different identity in terms of like being a man and not a son or a caregiver. So it also, like, his change in role there, and then not even being able to have that anymore, not being able to explore that part of himself at all either.
Correct. And then, like, speaking of his mother, like, the relationship with her gets changed, right? His, like, social interactions with her, it's like being a good son, being a caregiver, like being there for his mom, as he, like, really takes that to heart. That's a point of pride with him, and that's part of his social identity.
Which we see in his daydream when he's on the show. He talks about being a good son,
right,
and how important that is to him,
right,
and how much he wants the world to know that I've done this my whole life, and this is a point of pride. I think you're absolutely right, Ben. And
then when he finds out a couple things, one that, you know, it's clear to him that he's never known who his father was, and when he finds that letter that his mother has written to Thomas Wayne, it gets real disruptive to his identity really fast.
Absolutely.
Like his mother believing that he is the son of Thomas Wayne, which I think is mostly not true, but his little signature on the back of her photo is
fucking weird, and
a little bit weird.
And
which makes me think maybe she had an affair with him, and then she also adopted this kid to carry out a fantasy of her own.
And that's
probably the most likely,
or a delusion of her own.
I think that's the most likely outcome.
So it could be both parts of all the story could be true, and also parts could be very untrue.
Absolutely,
I think so. But what we see is he loses that identity of, like, being just me and mom, to being like, wait a minute, I was abandoned by this billionaire who could be helping us, but my mom's been asking for help and asks me every day if his letters came in, so that they continued, like, feeling of being beaten down and ignored and isolated, but yet still, like, living in mom's, latching onto the messaging from the Wayne family that anyone who works for us is a family, even though it's very clear she has not worked in a long time.
Well, also, I think it's just that thing of, I guess for me watching it, like, he does so much every day to keep her healthy and safe and take care of her, and yet she is putting all of her attention and positivity onto this guy that she hasn't interacted with in years and years and years, and how frustrating, to say the least, that would be as the caregiver of, like, I'm your family and I'm the one who's been, like, taking care of you day in and day out my whole life, and yet you are idolizing this guy who's not even around and probably mistreated her. You know,
absolutely
did mistreat her.
Well, I mean, we know she's got mistreated, right?
Yeah. And so that, I think, could be... I mean, I think the thing we haven't really addressed yet, which we mentioned in the front, is that's what, when he finally sees the file and he kills her, is this constant theme in the movie that he gets pushed to the point of violence and homicide repeatedly. And this idea that once he kind of breaks the seal on murder, he's just like this giddy murderer, and that he has no moral, like, I guess he does have moral because he doesn't kill his other friend, the little person, but he still is. I don't know. It's this weird. It doesn't make sense to me, I guess, is what I'm saying, is like that he can be this person, even in a psychotic episode, even in a manic episode, like being someone who is very sweet and tries to be very mindful of everyone around him, even when they're mistreating him, that then he becomes this full-fledged, like, murderer on, like, a crime spree who doesn't really have a lot of consideration for life.
I disagree with that in several ways.
Okay, go ahead.
Is not that your point is on, but that interpretation is something that I heard from a lot of critics. But every kill in this movie was extremely personal.
Yeah.
He did not target. He had no random violence in this movie.
Yeah, I guess what I mean is that he thinks that's okay, even if he's been personally wronged.
That's
what I
argument.
mean. That's what I
okay.
mean.
I didn't. It wasn't clear to me what you're saying. Now I understand.
Yeah, like he goes from someone who seems to be very precious about other people, and then he's just like, if you've done something to me, then like it's like once he killed someone, he's like, well, fuck it, I rip that Band-Aid off. So anyone who wrongs me, like, I've already become a killer, so why not keep killing?
I think it was deeper than that, more ingrained into that it's there, but it didn't become like that petty. It was still like Randall had tried to, like, had been bullying him and like even like acting like he was his friend, had kind of set him up and got him into all sorts of trouble on his own terms.
Yeah.
Like it was the relationship there. There's indicative that like him being his little buddy was weird. There was something weird in that relationship.
Here's the thing. The long and the short of it is that it's another movie that perpetuates this idea that if you get mentally ill, or if you're mentally ill and if you get pushed enough to a breaking point, you will just start hurting people, maybe even murdering people.
Yes.
And then once you started doing it, you'll keep doing it. And that's like that one, you can be both very, very ill, but yet can be very, very thoughtful about carrying through with your murder plots. At least with killing the talk show host.
For sure.
Yes. Yes. And that is definitely where I mentioned like I have my disagreements with it because they undid the good work that they did. But before we get there real quick, let's look at there's a few more social things that we need to consider. Is that the adoption.
Yeah. So he probably has attachment stuff, like depending on how old he was adopted, what the environment was like before he was adopted.
Well, not only that, it's that his realization that he was adopted. He's believed his whole life like it was me and my mom.
True.
And that was everything to him. To have that impact taken away and realize that he not only is he not... or that mom is obsessed with Thomas Wayne and he's possibly Thomas Wayne's son, which definitely engages some of that risky behavior, going to like talk to Bruce.
Yeah, that's definitely risky behavior.
And
then putting his fingers in a child's mouth.
Right, and choking Alfred.
Yeah, he choked Alfred.
Yeah.
Which is a mistake, because Alfred was SAS.
Okay, okay, nerd.
Get a grip.
But
anyway, but the things we see is that loss, right? He loses all his sense of identity and who he is and what he means to him. And once he loses that is the final step to where he breaks fully into psychosis. Is because that's when he murders his mom. Because he realizes he's been lied to his entire life by everyone, including her.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And that she failed to protect him. And part of her failures to protect him is why he's having so many issues. That's when he kills her. And it's that loss of identity, a loss of social meaning.
Yeah.
And social safety nets. He's lost everything.
Yeah, and I think for me, I kind of also read it more of like, this is the final straw. Like maybe he's been like creating a narrative in his head about why it's okay that he takes care of this woman who doesn't really like, hasn't been great to him, or has kind of shaped a life that isn't really working out for him. But now he finds out all this stuff too. Like, I mean, I get that in terms of he's done with her. Does he have to kill her? She's already in the hospital.
I mean, of course not, but...
I think the other part that is a little bit... I don't know if I believe it or not, is the fact that he gets the file and reads the file and is not... Like, clearly he's triggered at the end of reading it, but the fact that he's able to understand and use, I feel like there's a lot better chance that somebody would dissociate during that period of time of reading all of those things. Like, I just don't know how I feel about that. I think it makes a lot of sense because it is a break in his identity, like in terms of him killing his mom. Like, I think his actions make sense, but I don't know if I believe him like reading the file and not having a reaction until after he reads it. Like, I think it very much would be happening, and whether or not he would even get all the information, I think is kind of unlikely. But I think it absolutely, that's the final straw. I think it's really clear to see that he is now completely disconnected from reality in terms of how he is, and which is why I think then we really see that when he's getting ready to go on the show.
Right. So let's move into treatment, because I feel like Final Thoughts is going to have a lot more ideas that we haven't covered yet that I think fit really well there. Daily talking about the chronic mental illness, how it's represented, those things that we're starting to touch on. But
sure,
let's look at treatment for someone like this, someone dealing with bipolar disorder, with the most recent episode being manic with severe psychotic features, right? We're seeing this.
Yes.
We're seeing him in a severe state of mania with psychotic features. The treatment for this at this point in time where he's at is hospitalization.
Absolutely.
Especially if, like you're saying, he hasn't had his medication for a while. Because also, correct, I would imagine the medication he might be on at that time in history is the kind of medication you can't just stop taking. Like, it would have like a really bad effect on you, like physiologically.
Correct. He's taking 7 different things. There's no way that just stopping them at any point in time is going to have any sort of good outcome.
Like, my assumption would be, and I'm not a psychiatrist, is that he probably would be, if he is diagnosed with bipolar at that time, he'd probably be on lithium, would be my assumption.
Extremely likely.
And that lithium is something you really have to be careful when you're on it, when you're coming off of it, all that stuff. So if he just stopped taking it.
And he's probably on an antipsychotic of some kind. If
you can
not
have withdrawal symptoms from those.
Like the fact that he went off of his medication and we didn't see him experiencing any withdrawal, I feel like is very unlikely.
Well, we did see irritability increase and change and stuff, so maybe we did see some of it, but
maybe
it's obviously not a focus of what the director is trying to show.
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
But what we see, lithium is going to lose effectiveness. Lithium has a therapeutic range that is very narrow. Mm-hmm. And when people stop taking it, they're not likely to have seizures or withdrawal from that, but they're likely to lose the mood stabilization they would have gotten it from, and lithium controls that high.
Yeah.
So if he's taking lithium or any sort of mood stabilizer, he's on 7 meds, we can assume he's taking an antipsychotic, a antidepressant, a mood stabilizer, as well as a few other things. Right?
Yeah, and probably maybe taking meds to counteract the side effects of his other meds. Like, that's a common thing we'll see in adults that are on a ton of meds.
Right, anticonvulsant to control the side effects of tardive dyskinesia.
Yeah.
So, shaking. Like, a lot of a lot of medications can give you the shakes pretty bad. And,
particularly the old school antipsychotics.
Mm-hmm. Which he most likely would be on. So I think you're absolutely right, Ben. I think that when somebody is in the state that we see Arthur in, the only option is for him to be hospitalized, for him to be able to become stable, be reconnected with reality, maybe get nourished. A lot of times people who are experiencing full manic episodes are not aware of when they're hungry, they're not sleeping. So even just getting his body physically connected and kind of stable in terms of just health-wise, it would be really important for him to be in the hospital as well for those reasons. And that there is a pretty big chance that if he wasn't hospitalized, that I don't know what would happen to him, because that's really the only other thing that needs to be done.
Well, I mean, we see some of what would happen to him, like he'd get hit by a car.
Well, I think what would more have happened to him in this movie, is he would got like those guys on the train would have beat him to death, or he would have killed himself after like being beat several times, because that kind of stuff can give you like traumatic flashbacks. Like, it can, be really traumatizing because it reminds you of when you're young or when other things have happened to you. But I think he needs to be hospitalized. He needs to be stabilized, slowly, carefully, ideally put on medication again, but also be put on like more heavier duty stuff that they can put him on for the short term while the more long-term medication builds up. But that stuff needs to be monitored because it can have like a really intense effect on you. Like I was saying, like the shakes, it can be really sedating. Mm-hmm. And so then you need someone to help you with the physical stuff. Like you were saying, Hannah, when you're in that level of sedation, just to make sure that you're safe. I think he's someone that would need community support once he got out of the hospital, or maybe whatever. He might have to stay like in sort of like rehab-y situation for a little bit after the hospital.
I mean, at this point in time, the long-term care psychiatric facilities still exist.
Yeah.
Not for much longer, but they still do. I think that's where we see him, is in a psychiatric hospital, a long-term one, like a state hospital.
Yeah.
There's only, I think, 2 or 3 left in the state of Illinois at this point. So there used to be several, and now there's 2 here, or 3. But seeing him in a place like that is where he's going to go. Like, now they'd end up in a nursing home or a rehab type of facility like you're talking about. But at this point in time, like, it's going to be
Well, I'm kind
hospital.
of thinking about, like, if we were treating him now.
Yeah.
Like, he would probably need... We used to all do community support, which is you would go out and work, like, kind of do social work with people in the community and help them, like, find an apartment and maybe get a part-time job and make sure they're getting their meds. Like, basically make sure they're functioning within society. I would imagine after leaving the hospital, especially since, let's say his mom died and he wasn't the one who killed her. Let's just say she died.
Sure.
I don't know, like, if the apartment was in his mom's name, like, were they paying with her social security? Like, he might need to really rebuild a functioning life. And so a community support person, which can be a social worker or a therapist, whatever, like, can help him sort of get back on his feet. That's something that's actively being done in Illinois because of lawsuits against nursing homes that were keeping mentally ill people
past the point that they needed to, with no path out.
Yeah, and so it would be like, how do we find housing? How do we get back into the world? All that stuff to be stabilized. And then they would be checked in a lot by the community support team to make sure that they're, also it's a way to be social too. Like socializing, getting social skills, getting feedback about how they're behaving sort of in the community. Kind of it's a way to, like, get you back into the world.
And essentially the idea is that we help. A community support team is a team of five or six people who have mental health or mental health practitioners. And so the idea being that they can help someone maintain their independence to some level out in the community by also helping them build their own independent living skills, so that maybe at some point they won't need the same support, but also if they do, that's fine. So I think it makes a lot of sense. I think he absolutely would hopefully be assigned and connected to a community support, someone who offers that. So in the state of Illinois, that's Thresholds, Trilogy, C4. There's a couple of different ones that we have here. And I think that would very much make sense in terms of what he would need. I think he would need a lot of support. And also that if he would have maybe had that before, the idea being when you have that many people who are working with you, we can also help them learn the triggers and the symptoms of maybe when their moods are changing. And so we can help them kind of manage that and learn more about themselves and increase their awareness so that they maybe don't have to end up in the hospital. Although for some people that is a regular part of managing their mental illness, and that's okay too.
Yep, especially with bipolar disorder, the biggest challenge you have is that people start to feel better, or people start to feel so bad from the side effects that they stop taking them. So they either feel better and think they don't need to take it anymore, and then that they can manage now. They know what to do. They can use these skills to watch, which, I just wish that was true. For their case, because I know a lot of people, it's a matter of pride, but it's also a matter of dealing with heavy-duty medications that can seriously impact the way you function in a lot of ways that aren't obvious to other people, making it difficult to sleep, or making it difficult to wake up, making it difficult to have an orgasm or maintain an erection, or to be properly lubricated, any of that kind of stuff. Like, it has so many side effects in so many ways that people get tired of taking the damn meds, and they also just get tired of putting meds in their mouth, and they can make your stomach upset, they can make you shake. There's so many downsides to it, so it's important to understand and have some empathy for people when they're saying, I'm tired of taking these damn meds.
And also, a lot of what I've heard in the world working anecdotally is, like, I don't feel like myself when I'm taking medication. I know it's better for me. It's like the pros and cons of I'll be stable, but I won't ever maybe be myself.
Yeah.
And that is heartbreaking to think, like, I don't know if Arthur knows who he is, so I don't know if that'd be a complaint he would have. But
right.
Yeah, but I guess I don't know, speaking as a child therapist in the room in terms of treatment, it sounds like when he was a kid, he was removed from his mother's custody for a short period or some period of time, because it sounds like she was arrested and sentenced.
Yeah.
Yes. And so that would be the time as a child therapist, little Arthur, you'd intervene And then you would do a lot of maybe person-centered work. It would be a lot of feeling seen, like maybe play therapy. I don't know exactly. I can't remember. Did they say how old he was?
No.
4.
Was that little?
9. I don't think they said.
Those are
I
very
think he was
different numbers.
4.
But anyway, regardless,
When he was adopted, maybe he was 4, and then like the abuse, they
You
found
might
it
be
9.
right. You might be right.
And so I think he'd be a kid that I would really let, not run sessions, but I would let them kind of like be in the room with me. I might do what we call like more play therapy techniques, which is kind of like have a bunch of like toys, for lack of a better term, out and just kind of let him feel out the space. I think helping him feel safe with me would be that, like, maybe the first couple times we meet, he just kind of wanders around my office and touches all my stuff and asks me a bunch of random questions if he does want to ask questions. You know, I don't pressure him. I think, because where I think the therapist that we see in this movie, or the social worker, really, was not great, is that she's not really letting, like I said, letting him lead, or she's asking like it, but like we said, it's probably systemic. Like, she's asking questions for her own agenda. And I think with Arthur, as a kid, as I'd see him, I wouldn't have an agenda. I would say, what do you want to do? Show me. And then let him kind of lead. And hopefully that would lead him to feel more security, have from having like one relationship, even though it was professional, where he felt secure.
I mean, I think that would be important. So I think, in summary of treatment for what we need to see here, is that we see Arthur at this point doesn't have family. He doesn't have other relationships. Like, if we had been able to intervene at that point where he was young, and Brittany's example there would have been a huge intervention, could have made a tremendous turn in his case.
Yeah.
For how the outcome is. But where we see him now, I think we would see hospitalization. We would see likely long-term residential for a while to get him stabilized and get his life back together. And then, he would end up in prison if these murders actually happened. We know the one did. But we would want to see a combination of medication, of social skill building. We'd want to see a return to work. That is a huge component of giving someone an identity, a sense of purpose, and engagement with the community. We need to see all of those things, and then eventually, hopefully, a reintegration into community. That's what we'd want to see for Arthur, not the Joker, for Arthur, right? But I feel like we're all in agreement because we're all kind of saying the same thing, so I don't have anything extra to add to the points you two made about the community support he would need. Let's look at final thoughts here on this film. What are your reactions to it?
I think it was fine. I know I went into it kind of hateful because I think I'd been hearing about it so much that I was like, oh, this freaking... I was sick of it before I even saw it, to be quite frank.
It took you 6 months to watch a damn movie.
Yeah. I don't apologize for it. But I think Joaquin Phoenix obviously did a great job. I think it just is a bummer. Like, I wrote bummer a bunch of times in my notes because it's really hard. I think as someone who's worked in the field, I don't need to see this story in front of me. Like, I know this story, and I've worked with people who've had the story, not the murder parts, but like the being shit on by society over and over and over again. And I guess it's good, besides the murder parts, for people to be educated on mental health, besides the murder parts. But I don't need to see what I've already experienced. It just made me really sad. But I did think Joaquin did a good job of demonstrating mental illness. I think up to, like Ben, you're saying, up to the third act, I think it does a good job demonstrating what it can be and what it can look like and how people present like it. He definitely felt like someone I would have worked with when I was on community support. And I think stylistically the movie is pretty good. But I wish, and I get that it's the Joker. It's based on a comic book character that is a villain. It bums me out because it's like, am I supposed to feel bad I know it's the constant thing, you're supposed to feel bad for a guy and then not bad for him, but it's just the same thing we've talked about here a bunch of times, which is I don't need to see another story about a very sad person turning into violence and us having to be scared of them. Like, this continued narrative of you should be scared of of people who are mentally ill. So goodbye on that.
Hannah?
So I think that this movie did somewhat of a good job. I don't know if I agree that it did a great job of explaining a lot of different things. I think one part that is always heartbreaking to see is the systemic problems that we have in this country in terms of mental health, and how people who don't have to deal with the kind of circumstances that Arthur has to deal with don't have a fucking clue about how hard it is to get any kind of services, how hard it is to be connected, especially just in terms of the way that the system is set up is that the people with the least experience help the people who have chronic mental illness.
So true.
So then what ends up happening is that they either then get burnt out and stop being in the field, but also that means a high turnover, so that the people who need the most consistent support in terms of not having to make new relationships with, 100 different caseworkers throughout their lifetime would really make a fucking difference. And that doesn't happen because of the way the system is set up in terms of what's covered, what's not covered, and the amount of crisis people have to be in order to get the services that they should have been receiving all along. So just as that part they kind of touched on, but just to let people know, this very much that scene of him sitting in front of someone and having them say, we're closing, we don't know how you're going to get your meds, and also we can't do anything about it. That is something that happens to people.
Yeah.
Yep.
That is something and you want to know why the ER is so busy? Because people that is the only way. There are so few psychiatrists that even take Medicaid, let alone should be even seeing people. Is the only option people have is that they have to go to the ER in order to get their medication managed and being seen by different people instead of having one consistent provider. So just whenever you are having thoughts about you think you know what you're talking about people who have chronic mental illness, you don't have a clue. This somewhat touches on it, but we still have a very long way to go. And there's a reason why none of us are in that field anymore.
Yeah.
Because I had to stop doing it. And that's not fair, because that's not even the people that I was working with. Like, they definitely have way harder things that they dealt with. But I had to stop working there because I couldn't emotionally handle being in a system that was that broken.
Well, it's broken. It's also, like Ben, you were saying, it's your least experienced people doing that job. And also you get paid shit too. So like, it doesn't it's not a career. It's a job.
Yeah, exactly.
And the people that make it their career, I mean, I could often have circumstances where they have a partner or a family that they have some sort of external funding source that they can do it, or they just really love it and they find a way to make it work. But they sacrifice so much.
I mean, it's the classic, like, overworked and underpaid and underappreciated.
Absolutely. So in terms of final thoughts, I think I just wanted to make sure that I talked about that.
Sure.
But also, I think Joaquin Phoenix does a really good job of acting just in terms of the way this was written. I think that, as always, this is fucking horseshit. That again, it's somebody who's committing violence, who has mental illness. If there's anything we don't need, it's that. So I'm never going to watch this movie again. Ever. Because I don't need any reminders. And again, being in the same situation as you and Brittany and maybe even Ben, I don't need to see this. I have a whole list of people that I worked with who are experiencing similar things, who have had a life of trauma, who I couldn't do anything for because the system is so fucked.
And they don't get to become a badass villain within a comic book either.
Exactly. So
no,
I won't ever watch it again, and I won't ever tell anybody to watch it because I don't think that it does the same kind of damage that this kind of shit always does, and I'm just not fucking interested in being behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll go. I think that Hannah just nailed it right there.
Yeah.
Hannah just nailed it, and everyone should really, rewind that and listen to it again, especially if you have no experience with this population.
Especially if you think this movie's really killing it in terms of its, its presentation of the mentally ill.
Yeah, it's 80% of the movie, it did that.
Yeah.
The last act, it undid everything that it did.
It undid it and then went too far.
See, the thing that you see in most movies, or most chronically mental ill cases, is that the parts where he's on the ground being targeted, being beaten up, being a constant victim of the system, being a person having every support taken away from him, and finding out that every part of the story that he has been told his whole life is false, and that it is worse at every turn, and that his parents failed him, and that everyone else failed him, and that he has been fucked with no chance of recovery due to constant lying, constant failures, constantly being under the gun of society and being a victim because of his mental illness. That part nailed it. They nailed it. They undid all of it. Like Hannah said, all of it undid when they showed him unraveling into immediate violence, and that being his vindication, and that being his way of regaining his power in his life. That they undid, and that part makes me angry.
Also, this whack narrative that you can be that mentally ill, but you can also be a criminal mastermind. You can't be both.
I don't think they showed him as a criminal mastermind.
Yeah, but I mean, like, if we're going to say he's going to be the Joker.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I don't feel like this Joker would ever be a nemesis for Batman, personally.
Well, I think... sorry to interrupt, but Brittany was telling me that she watches Unspooled, and they did an episode on this, and Paul Scheer, who's one of the hosts, said, this very much seems like someone that the Joker, the person that the villain we're actually talking about, would be inspired by this person, by Arthur Fleck. That not necessarily that he becomes the Joker,
right,
but much more that people around him, all those people who were kind of in the social movement of like kill the rich,
like Joker rises up from that.
Absolutely.
Which is sort of the narrative that happened, I'm not supposed to do this, in Gotham. The show Gotham, which it's sort of the narrative that happened there.
Okay.
It's sort of how that happened. They lost their own message in there, but that's a different discussion. But like this movie, I thought that Joaquin Phoenix did a wonderful job. His acting was superb, and I think he absolutely deserved his Best Actor for it.
Except for they didn't nominate Adam Sandler for Uncut Gems, and once you see that movie, then you can fucking tell me if you think he deserves it, because he doesn't.
I'll watch it, but I think that this movie did a great job for 80% of it, and then undid it. I think that the movie was shot and designed beautifully. I loved everything about the way they set it up, the way they immersed you in the world, the way they used the sound, the music, the lighting, everything to convey the moods. But the way that they thought that they were telling the story of mental illness and how someone devolves into this, like, they just lost it when they switched him into like being that patently aggressively violent. Like showing him contemplating killing himself several times, like pointing the gun at him, miming that, going through that rehearsal. All of that was really good, and showing the impulsivity of it and the way they let Joaquin act impulsively. I know they recorded some of those scenes 40 times of showing him like entering the talk show to talk to Murray. They recorded that like 40 times to get different ways that would go. They just let him go and improv through it. And the unpredictability that came with that was a wonderful way to shoot this film. But in the end, like the mental illness, the psychology part of this film, so much was accurate, and then they ruined it.
Yeah, so I guess our final thoughts is watch Uncut Gems.
That is not our final thoughts. That does not represent the official view of Ben Stover LCPC.
You haven't seen it yet.
The interviews in this podcast represent solely the opinions of those
speaking.
giving him.
Well, anyway, I hope you guys finally enjoy us finally talking about the Joker. Like Ben said, we've had so many reviews. So, contact us. Like, email us again at popcornpsychology@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of, our thoughts about this movie. You can also find us at Instagram, Facebook at Popcorn Psychology, Twitter, we're at popcorn_psych. Always, you can leave us reviews at Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to us and enjoy us. You can always give us more requests. Give us your feedback. We're happy to get it from you.
And stay tuned for the rest of season 3. We're excited to bring this for you. Have a good time.